The janitor spoke 7 languages, but no one cared, until the CEO heard her speak Arabic, German, and Portuguese, all in 1 hour. By the end of the week, she had a new job title, and it didn't involve mops. Elena Marquez wasn't trying to impress anyone. She showed up early, stayed late, and kept to herself. Every morning she walked through the same glass doors at Sterling and Hume Global, pushed her cleaning cart to the elevator, and disappeared into the halls. People passed her like she was furniture. But Elena listened. When interns whispered in Korean, when managers gossiped in French, when clients panicked in Russian, she understood it all. She just never said a word. Not until Tuesday, when a vendor came in, lost and frustrated. Asking for help in Portuguese, she answered, without thinking. Then 2 executives laughed in German about a foreign applicant. She turned to them and said in their language, "He speaks better English than both of you." That was the first time someone looked at her differently. Then came the Arabic-speaking client who couldn't find the conference room. Security froze. Elena didn't. And that's when Christopher Hume, the CEO, stopped walking. He didn't say anything. He just stood there quietly, watching this woman, this janitor, solve more problems in 60 seconds than some of his managers did in a month. He didn't ask who she was. He didn't need to. 3 days later, her ID badge didn't open the janitor's closet anymore. It opened the executive wing. By Wednesday morning, rumors had already started. Not official ones, just quiet questions in the break room. "Did you hear what happened yesterday? Who was that woman speaking Arabic near the main lobby? Is she new?" But the truth was quieter than the whispers. Elena was still wearing the same shoes she'd mopped floors in 2 days ago, still had her name stitched into her navy blue uniform, still moved like someone who wasn't used to being seen. And yet people were watching her now, noticing things they never had before, like how she never checked Google Translate, how she could switch from one language to another without blinking, and how she always looked composed. Not smug, not self-satisfied, just composed, like she knew who she was, like maybe she always had. In a meeting room on the 17th floor, HR Director Marlene Beck was staring at Elena's file. It was embarrassingly short. Hired 2 years ago through a third-party janitorial service. No formal education listed, no emergency contacts. No one had ever asked her for anything beyond a mop bucket and a signature. And yet yesterday, a high-profile international vendor specifically requested the woman who spoke to me in perfect Portuguese. Beck didn't know what to make of it. Neither did the VP of Operations or the client relations lead, who had apparently received an email from an ambassador's office in Berlin that simply read, "Promote her. You'd be foolish not to." Elena didn't know about any of this. She was in the back office, now temporarily reassigned to liaison services, whatever that meant. They hadn't told her what her job was yet, only that she should stop cleaning and wait for instructions. So she did what she always did. She watched, listened, and stayed quiet until she was called into a meeting with the executive team. The boardroom was colder than usual, or maybe it just felt that way to Elena. She didn't even own a blazer. Her hair was still tied in the same low bun she wore on cleaning shifts. No one offered her coffee. No one asked if she was comfortable. They just stared, as if trying to reconcile the stories they'd heard with the woman in front of them. A man at the far end of the table finally spoke. "Michael Hargrove, Senior VP. "I don't think we've been properly introduced," he said with a rehearsed smile, though his eyes never quite softened. "You've made quite the impression this week." Elena didn't smile back. "I wasn't trying to." The room shifted, a few eyebrows raised. Marlene Beck cleared her throat and attempted to steer the tone back to something more professional. "We were reviewing your interactions with our international partners," she said, tapping her pen nervously. "And, well, frankly, we're confused. Your language proficiency, it's beyond impressive. Can we ask where you trained?" Elena paused. She could have said self-taught. She could have mentioned the tiny radio she used to translate foreign news broadcasts as a child, or how she'd memorized cassette tapes of different languages because books weren't allowed where she lived. But instead she just said, "I listened more than most." Silence again, the kind that made people uncomfortable, but Elena didn't rush to fill it. She let it sit. Hargrove leaned forward, his fingers laced together. "We want to know if you're interested in something more formal," he said. "A role that makes use of your skill set. Strategic communications, perhaps, diplomacy work. We're not sure yet, but we are sure we've overlooked you." Elena looked around the room. 12 people, most of whom had passed her in the halls for years without a second glance. And now here they were, acting like they'd discovered fire. "Why now?" she asked. The question hung in the air like a challenge. No one answered, and maybe that was answer enough. There were moments Elena remembered that didn't fit on any application, like translating medical instructions for 3 families in a shelter when she was 16, or the time she intercepted a shipment of expired food at her 3rd janitorial job, alerting a manager who hadn't even known the dates mattered, or when she helped a crying intern fix a botched presentation in Portuguese because no one else understood why the foreign client had gone silent. She never bragged about these things. She wasn't raised that way. She had been taught to show up, work quietly, and never expect applause, but that didn't mean she hadn't earned it. And now, as they scoured her background, searching for some paper trail to explain what she had done, Elena sat still, letting them wrestle with the idea that talent didn't always announce itself with framed degrees or polished LinkedIn profiles. Her records confused them. Some work history, yes, but patchy. One employer had described her as punctual, another had scribbled dependable in blue ink on a referral letter that had been photocopied so many times it was barely legible. They wanted dates, schools, certifications, but Elena offered something else: evidence. Every hallway where she fixed a broken process, every overlooked moment where she quietly, consistently made things better, every person who remembered what it felt like to be seen by someone who wasn't trying to impress, but simply trying to help. They wanted a narrative that fit. She didn't give them one. She gave them truth, and it was harder to process than anyone expected. When Elena entered the conference room, something in the air felt altered. Gone was the stiff politeness, the forced smiles. This time, they looked at her with something they hadn't shown before: attention. 4 people sat across the table. High-level executives, the kind who were used to being the smartest ones in the room, but now they weren't talking. They were waiting. Elena placed her hands on the table and looked each of them in the eye. Not to challenge, not to intimidate, just to be seen. And for once, she was... One of them cleared her throat. "We've been going over system logs. You've been making corrections." Quietly. Another older man leaned forward, tapping the folder in front of him. Internal translations, external communications, regional memos. All refined, all improved, but no record of anyone asking you to do it. Elena didn't respond. She didn't need to. A younger executive, probably new enough to still be stunned by the truth, flipped through the documents like he was trying to find a page that made this make sense. These edits, they weren't small. You changed entire narratives. Some of these went out under the company's name. Still, Elena said nothing. They expected a denial, or at least a defense, but she gave them neither. She had spoken clearly through every change she made, every note in the margins, every better word where a lazy one once stood. This meeting was only necessary because they were finally reading what had been in front of them all along. They weren't angry. They were embarrassed, and for the first time, they started asking the right question. Not who she was, but how they had missed her for so long. They didn't know how to end the meeting. The conference room fell into a quiet that wasn't awkward. It was weighty, not because Elena had said something shocking, but because she hadn't said much at all. And somehow, that left a deeper impression than any speech they could have prepared. The VP, who'd spent the first year ignoring her existence, was now glancing at her like he was trying to place her in a world he thought he understood. The woman in charge of internal communications had stopped fiddling with her pen. Even the regional director, who once joked that janitors should stay in their lane, was now watching her like someone watching a fire they couldn't put out. Elena stood, not abruptly, not for effect. She simply gathered the papers she'd brought, slid them into a folder, and nodded once. "I didn't do it for recognition," she said finally. Her voice was calm, measured. "But if words carry your brand, someone should care how they land." She walked out before anyone could respond. The door didn't slam. There was no cinematic exit. Just the sound of her footsteps echoing down the hall, clean, deliberate, final. Back at her station, the same grey cart sat waiting, still stocked, still labelled. She returned her ID badge to its usual clip and wheeled it toward the east wing like any other day. Except something was different now. People moved aside for her in the hallway, not out of politeness, but out of respect. 2 engineers who used to barely acknowledge her nodded when she passed. A manager she had once corrected in a company-wide memo, anonymously, gave her a small smile and stepped aside at the doorway. In the elevator, no one asked her what floor she was going to. No one assumed she was lost. When she exited onto the 3rd floor, the executive wing, it wasn't to clean anymore. It was to be briefed. And yet, even as she entered a new phase of visibility, Elena didn't shed the skin of who she had been. She still noticed which machines made that odd hum when they powered up. She still remembered which corner leaked during heavy rain. She still adjusted the thermostat by feel, not by number. She hadn't been promoted out of her old world. She had simply pulled the rest of them into it. By the time she returned to the janitor's break room to grab her things, the only other person inside, a young temp with a broom, was staring at her name in the company newsletter. He looked up, stunned. "Wait, this is you?" Elena nodded once, offered him a kind smile and gently took her mop from its hook. "Let them talk," she said softly, mostly to herself. "Words matter, but actions echo longer." Then she pushed the door open and disappeared into the hallway once again. Same walk, same rhythm, but everything had changed. The janitor's closet on the east wing still smelled like pine cleaner and old rubber gloves. Elena stood there for a moment, not doing anything, just standing, as if her body had walked her there by habit before her mind caught up. This was the place she had spent most of her years. No windows, no ventilation, and barely enough room to stretch her arms. The mop sink leaked. The light buzzed with a flicker that never went away. But it was hers. For a long time, this closet had been the only part of the building where she didn't have to explain herself. She looked around now with a different kind of gaze, not one of detachment or superiority, but of quiet reflection. Her hand traced the outline of a message once scribbled on the inside of the door in faded Sharpie. "Some people clean floors, some clean cultures." She had written it 6 years ago. No one had ever asked about it. Back then, she worked the night shift, by choice. The silence made it easier to think, easier to listen. People assumed the overnight staff were there because they had no other options. What they didn't know was that Elena preferred the hours when the building stopped pretending. At night, the truth echoed. She heard conversations no one remembered having. Heated whispers near office doors, panicked sighs over missed deadlines, muffled tears in the stairwell. She learned patterns. Who worked late out of passion, who stayed late out of fear. She saw how a place really functioned, not by policies but by people. And she took notes, mental ones, detailed and honest. That's how she'd caught the memo fiasco 2 years back. An executive had tried to push through a major internal policy change, one that would cut hours for contract workers without notifying them. But Elena had overheard the plan while mopping near the HR glass walls. The next morning, a perfectly worded anonymous email arrived in every director's inbox. Precise, detailed, backed with screenshots. The policy vanished by lunch. No one ever traced it to her. They just called it a lucky catch. Now she stood there, same room, different station in life. Her new office was 3 floors above, but her hand still reached for the mop handle without thinking. It wasn't sentimentality, it was memory. This place had taught her to listen and to watch, not just people but the spaces they inhabited, the way power moved without speaking, the way some names were spoken in full, while others were shortened like afterthoughts. She knew whose voices interrupted and whose voices paused politely, who knocked, who barged, who waited, who never came. She stepped out of the closet and let the door close softly behind her. Down the hall, the floor creaked slightly at the seam near the vending machines, just as it always had. She had reported it once, years ago, but no one followed up. It wasn't on the priority list. Now it was, because now, when she mentioned something, it didn't go unheard. The shift was subtle but palpable. A junior analyst passed her in the hall and didn't look away quickly like before. He slowed, nodded, and said, "Good morning, Ms. Alvarez." Not hi, not hey, not oh, just clear, steady acknowledgement. Elena returned the nod but didn't stop walking. She had learned long ago that when you finally gain visibility, The worst thing you can do is pause for applause. Let them adjust. Let them reconcile the past with the present. But don't wait for them to catch up. By the time she reached the glass doors leading to the main atrium, the morning sunlight was pouring in like it was late to the meeting. Her reflection stared back at her. Clean lines, buttoned blazer, hair tied with quiet precision. Not a disguise, not a transformation, just a version of herself the world had taken too long to recognize. And inside her the same rhythm hummed, observe, understand, act, in that order. Always in that order. She took a deep breath and walked through the doors. This time not to clean up someone else's mess, but to stop the next one from ever happening. The morning meeting was scheduled in the glass dome conference space, a room usually reserved for visiting diplomats and board members who needed the skyline to remind them of how high they'd climbed. Elena arrived 5 minutes early. Not because she wanted to impress anyone, but because she had spent years arriving early to spaces that barely acknowledged her when she did. It was a habit now, an instinct, like checking a mirror before you speak or listening twice before you talk. The assistant at the door stammered when she saw Elena's name on the list. You're Ms. Alvarez." It wasn't rude, just surprised. Elena gave a nod. "I am." She didn't elaborate. Inside, the room buzzed quietly with the kind of tension that fills a space when people are waiting for someone unexpected to take the lead. They had all read the memo. They had all seen the internal update. Most of them hadn't known her name last week. She walked to the seat with her nameplate on it, real, engraved, not printed, and sat without hesitation. No one said it aloud, but every glance screamed the same thought. How did she get here? She didn't owe them a story, but she had one anyway. The first 10 minutes were routine: project updates, language inconsistencies in the Africa brief, the failed outreach attempt in northern Brazil. People spoke in polished buzzwords, rounding every edge of their sentences to sound more in control than they were. Then someone turned to Elena. "Would you mind reviewing the phrasing on our Colombian partnership proposal?" She nodded and pulled the document toward her, but not before raising one question. "Are you asking me to review the grammar or the message?" A silence opened in the room. Not cold, but deep, because that was the difference, wasn't it? Most people read to check what's there. Elena read to feel what was missing. She scanned the paragraph. The wording was diplomatic but empty, full of promises and mutual growth and shared opportunity, but no curiosity, no recognition of what mattered to the people they were addressing, no sign that anyone had listened. "You're not asking them anything," she said calmly. "You're declaring interest without understanding need. That's not communication, that's marketing." She didn't raise her voice, didn't gesture wildly. She just spoke like someone who'd cleaned up after every version of this mistake and finally had the microphone before it happened again. A junior exec across the table leaned back, eyebrows raised, half impressed, half threatened. "Well, what would you suggest?" She didn't hesitate. "I'd suggest we learn who we're speaking to before deciding what to say." And just like that, the meeting changed. She wasn't being asked for language fixes anymore. She was guiding the strategy, not by force, not by charm, just by saying what no one else had dared to admit. After the meeting, a woman Elena had never spoken to before approached her near the elevator. She wore the badge of someone senior, but her voice came with the humility of someone newly aware. "I didn't realize you were this involved," she said. Elena met her eyes. "I've always been involved, you just weren't looking here." The elevator opened. She stepped inside. Doors closed. And for the first time in years, she didn't walk back into the world with a feeling of being tolerated. She walked in with the full weight of being understood. The hallway felt longer that day, not because anything had changed, but because Elena saw it differently now. The corners she used to sweep in silence had become places where she now paused, not to clean, but to think. The quiet used to be comforting. Now it was full of voices she remembered from years spent unnoticed. It wasn't just the new title on her office door that made things shift. It was the absence of the assumptions. For the first time in a long while, no one interrupted her when she spoke. People listened, nodded, took notes, even the ones who used to avoid eye contact. The same colleagues who once stepped over her mop bucket were now reaching out to schedule meetings. But what they saw as a sudden rise to her felt more like a return to something she had always carried: She remembered translating eviction letters for the family across the street when she was 12, guiding her mother through doctor visits that required medical terms she hadn't learned yet. She had read through government forms, court notices, and financial paperwork for people who couldn't pronounce the names on the documents. That kind of fluency doesn't come from textbooks, it comes from survival. Every time someone complimented her for communicating clearly, she had to stop herself from laughing. She had been doing that her whole life, for people whose voices had never been given space to stretch. And yet, until now, no one thought to ask where she had learned any of it. They saw confidence, not the decades of necessity that forged it. They saw articulation, not the years of decoding threats dressed as policies. They saw a polished professional. They never imagined the girl who once had to negotiate rental extensions while still wearing her school uniform. She sat at her desk, sunlight catching the edge of her keyboard. Around her a dozen conversations flowed through glass walls and polished floors. But what echoed loudest was something quieter than all of them, the feeling that after years of being everyone's interpreter, she was finally being heard in her own language, not because someone gave her permission, but because she had stopped waiting for them to ask. Meetings used to move fast, too fast for anyone to question the phrasing in a proposal or wonder whether the words we used landed the way we thought they did. But ever since Elena began attending, the pace had shifted, just slightly. Enough for people to pause before speaking, like they were weighing something invisible. She didn't interrupt, didn't take over. She simply listened longer than most were used to. During one planning session, a project lead referred to a new community partnership as a penetration strategy. No one blinked. Except her. She didn't sigh or shake her head. She just looked at the page for a while, then said, "We might want to reconsider the language. It doesn't read the way we think it does." The room went still. Someone chuckled nervously. She didn't explain further. She didn't need to. He changed the term. She wasn't trying to win arguments. She just spoke the way people do when they've lived through what everyone else is still pretending to understand. Words started getting around. People began forwarding her documents for review, not for editing, but for sense, for tone, for empathy. An analyst from another department sent her a message that read, "I've been trying to say this for weeks, but you said it in 10 words. She didn't know how to answer that. For most of her life, she had been the one whose voice never quite made it into the room. Now, people were quoting her in rooms she hadn't entered yet. She walked past a whiteboard one afternoon and saw one of her phrases written at the top in red marker. No attribution. No one said who had written it there. But the message was hers. She stood still for a moment. It wasn't pride she felt. It was relief. Relief that she no longer had to explain why certain words didn't land the way others thought they would. Relief that she didn't have to soften the edges of her thoughts just to be allowed to share them. Things weren't perfect. People still stumbled. But at least now they looked up when they did. And that, after all these years, was something. There was a memo, a standard one, announcing updates to the onboarding process. Nothing flashy, just bullet points, dates, departmental notes. But halfway through, there was a paragraph that made Elena stop. It explained how every new hire would now receive communications in more than one language, not as a request, as protocol. She read it twice, then again. It didn't have her name on it. No one had asked her to approve it, but the phrasing was familiar. The tone was careful, measured. The words weren't just translated. They had been chosen. She leaned back in her chair, trying to remember the last time something official had made her feel seen. It took longer than she expected. Later that day, she walked past the training room. Inside, a young employee was explaining a concept to a new hire in Mandarin. Nobody looked surprised. Nobody asked why they weren't using English. It was just happening, like it belonged. In the hallway, she overheard someone from marketing rehearsing a pitch in Portuguese. Someone else corrected his pronunciation gently. He laughed, thanked them, and started again. A few months ago, moments like this would have drawn stares. Now they passed without comment, as if the company had always been like this, as if it had always known how to listen in more than one voice. Elena didn't take credit. What mattered wasn't that her influence showed, it was that it no longer needed to. People were adjusting without being told, thinking twice without being pushed. Teams were asking new kinds of questions, not about whether someone could speak, but whether their words were being carried with care. She walked into a strategy session that afternoon and found a printed document on the table. It was a guide, something she'd helped draft months ago when she was still listed as support staff. But now the guide had a new title and a footer that read, "Adapted by Elena Alvarez." No announcement had been made, no one had told her it would be included. But there it was, quietly part of the system now. Official. Normal. She looked around the table. The others were already discussing timelines, deliverables, projections. No one was waiting for her to react. She didn't say anything, just opened her notebook and joined in. The room no longer paused when she entered, because she was already part of the rhythm. She got the call at 4:45 p.m., just as she was packing up for the day. It wasn't urgent, no crisis, just a request from the executive office. Could she attend a meeting tomorrow morning to help mediate language use in a cross-regional rollout? The phrasing struck her, not translate, not interpret, not simplify, mediate. She sat back down slowly, her hand still resting on the zipper of her laptop case. For a long moment she didn't move. That one word felt heavier than any title she'd been given. For most of her life, she had stood between people and the things they feared they couldn't understand. She had explained the unspoken, softened the edges, made things make sense, often without being thanked or even noticed, and now they were asking her to do it with intention. In the morning, the meeting was already in motion when she walked in. Big table, suits, too many fonts on the printouts, but someone had saved her a chair, centered, not sidelined. No introductions were needed. She wasn't Elena from facilities anymore. She was someone people already knew, even if they hadn't met her. As the discussion picked up, someone asked whether the new slogan would resonate in Southeast Asia. Someone else worried about the tone in Eastern Europe. There were maps on the screen, notes in multiple languages. Then a pause. "Elena," the director said, turning toward her. "What do you think?" The question didn't come with a spotlight. It came naturally, like they'd asked her 100 times before. She looked at the tagline again, considered the weight of each word, then offered a different phrasing, shorter, warmer, not simplified, clarified. No one argued. They listened. They nodded. They moved forward. When the meeting ended, she stayed back a moment, looking at the screen one last time before it went black. It was the smallest thing, just a line of text, but it carried something bigger now. Her voice filtered through 1,000 past silences. She gathered her things quietly. This time the hallway didn't feel long. It felt like it had opened. The badge still worked. Same little click at the glass doors. Same gentle buzz under her fingertips. She walked in like she always did. Early, quiet, unnoticed by most. But this morning she didn't go straight to her office. Instead, she paused by the old janitor's closet. The one she used to keep spotless still smelled the same. Bleach, damp paper, a trace of lemon. The cart was gone. The shelves now held backup monitors, Ethernet cables, and forgotten cardboard boxes. No one had used this space in months. She stood there for a moment, not with nostalgia, just a kind of stillness, not because she missed it, but because it had been real. She remembered every morning she had stood there adjusting her gloves. Every afternoon she'd taken off her shoes in silence before entering the staff kitchen to mop, just so her footsteps wouldn't disturb anyone's phone call. Back then, the most generous thing anyone had said to her was, "Thanks, I didn't even notice you." And now she sat on strategy panels. Now her words shaped company policy. But this place, this small windowless room, had been her first office, her first desk, her first place of influence. She reached up and adjusted one of the boxes on the top shelf, just slightly, as if some part of her still wanted it to look neat. Then she left. At her desk, she reviewed 3 drafts of multilingual outreach for a healthcare partner in Kenya, gave feedback on tone and pacing, then drafted a short message in Spanish to a young intern who had submitted a brilliant pitch but wasn't sure if her accent would get in the way. Elena wrote back, "Your voice doesn't need permission," then closed her laptop and leaned back. Outside her window, the city moved, Emails sent, meetings started, doors opened and closed. But in this moment, she didn't move. She didn't need to. There was no final speech, no farewell ceremony, no single event to mark what had shifted. Just a quiet knowing that, after years of being the one who translated the room, she had become part of its architecture, and the echo of her voice didn't need to be loud to last.